Hi everyone, Happy New Year. I'm Chyill and welcome back to another detailed champion guide. Today I will be talking about Ruh Kaan, the Crypt Warden, and so sit back, relax and enjoy the show. Ruh Kaan is a tanky melee champion that is very versatile and he can be a huge pain for the enemy to deal with when he is played very well. I have been having quite a lot of fun playing with Ruh Kaan since he is so effective at being a nuisance to the enemy team, which is always nice I think. Not only is he disruptive to the enemy with his hook-like ability, which essentially allows him to have good control over the battlefield, he is also decently tanky because he has access to various abilities that deal damage to enemies and heal himself at the same time. In situations where enemies are further away, he also has a strong long-range poke for added pressure on the enemy, as well as a couple of ways to close the gap between you and your enemies. So, I think Ruh Kaan is a very versatile melee champion, but it might take a while to fully get used to his entire toolkit and to be able to perform well with him. Before we start, just like the other champion guides I have made previously for Ashka and Paloma to name a few, I have split this guide up into different sections and I have included timestamps directly to each section in the description below. As usual, feel free to skip ahead to the section that you need if you have already watched the video before. And again, we'll start the guide off with looking at Ruh Kaan's abilities before talking about his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Then we'll look at his Battlerites options, and finally finishing off with some of my gameplay tips and potential combos when using Ruh Kaan. And so without further ado, let's begin. First off, let's talk about his abilities. Starting off with Ruh Kaan's left click or mouse 1 ability, his mouse 1 ability is Defiled Blade. It is just a standard melee attack, but the interesting bit is when it is charged. The weapon recharges every 8 seconds, and when it is charged, the next mouse 1 will deal bonus damage to the enemy, heals yourself a little bit, as well as inflict the curse debuff on the enemy if it hits. The curse debuff makes it so that further melee attacks deal some bonus damage and also heals you for a little bit. Because the charge attack is so useful, you'll want to make sure that you keep an eye on it when it's ready and try to utilize it properly when it is. Spamming the mouse 1 is therefore unwise since you would likely waste the charge attacks, and this will severely reduce your battle effectiveness because you miss out on that large amount of damage and heal mainly. Moving on, his right click or mouse 2 ability is called Shadow Bolt. This is Ruh Kaan's long range poke and that deals a massive amount of damage, especially if your weapon is charged. It has a relatively low cooldown too, making it quite spammable, and so you'll likely be spamming this ability at your enemies when it is too risky to get closer to enemies to deal damage, or when you're trying to zone enemies. Ruh Kaan's spacebar ability is Sinister Strike, and it is one of his primary movement and iframe ability. Activating the ability makes Ruh Kaan jump a short distance toward the direction of the mouse and deals 16 damage at the impact location. While jumping, Ruh Kaan is actually invulnerable, and so using this ability at the right times so that an enemy attack lands just while he's jumping will allow him to avoid enemy attacks and abilities that he would otherwise not be able to avoid. Next up, his Q ability is Consume, and it is a shield-like ability that allows him to negate all projectile and melee attacks in front of him, and also snares melee attackers. Not only that, if it successfully blocks any attack, Ruh Kaan's weapon is recharged and Shadow Bolt's cooldown is refreshed. Refreshing Shadow Bolt's cooldown isn't that huge since it's actually just 4 seconds, but recharging the weapon can be quite huge, since it gives you that much more sustain and damage on the enemy. Ruh Kaan's E ability is Claw of the Wicked, and this is his hook-like ability. The ability basically shoots out a claw and pulls an enemy to you while draining some health from him. A hook-like ability has many useful uses as you know, so we'll go into more of its uses later in the video. Now let us move on to Ruh Kaan's abilities that require energy to use. Starting off with his R ability that costs 25 energy, it is called Nether Void. Nether Void is another one of Ruh Kaan's movement abilities, and it basically allows Ruh Kaan to teleport, and while he is teleporting, he is invulnerable to damage since he's warped somewhere, and he'll apply the curse debuff on enemies at the landing spot. Unlike his space ability that cannot jump over walls, this ability can, since he basically disappears and reappears elsewhere. Next up, his first EX ability is his Shift Space ability, Reaping Scythe. It costs 25 energy and it is basically a spin-like ability, where Ruh Kaan spins and deals damage while draining some health over the duration as well. Very simple. As great as the ability sounds though, the normal spacebar ability is much better, and this is usually not worth using over it, since it is easily cancelled and you're still quite vulnerable from a distance. His second EX ability is his Shift E ability, Claw of the Undying. It costs 25 energy as well, and it also still hooks people, but this time instead of hooking an enemy, this hooks an ally to you, while healing them for a decently large amount. Not only can it sometimes save your teammates from certain AoE abilities, the heal is also very good if your teammates are not support champions. Finally, Ruh Kaan's ultimate in the F key is Shadow Beast. Ruh Kaan transforms into a Shadow Beast and he has only two abilities in this form, his left click and right click abilities, but they are slightly altered in this form. His left click ability becomes this massive melee attack that cleaves and hits everyone in front of him in melee range for a large amount of damage, while healing himself with each successful hit. His right click ability becomes a hook ability, similar to his E ability, but this has 0 cooldown and does a lot higher damage. When in ulti form, Ruh Kaan deals massive damage and is very dangerous in melee range, but the downside is that he is very immobile since he cannot access his other abilities, and this makes him quite vulnerable to kiting. So there are definitely some drawbacks to consider when using it. And so that's about it for Ruh Kaan's abilities. Now, let us move on to his playstyle, strengths, and weaknesses. Ruh Kaan's playstyle, I feel, is a bit of a passive-aggressive playstyle. You cannot go full-on aggressive with him because once you've used up all your movement abilities, he's actually quite vulnerable, despite all of his abilities that allow him to heal himself while dealing damage. Being too passive is also not very good since he is a melee champion and we need to get close to deal decent damage. So a good balance between a more passive approach and a more aggressive approach is the best for Ruh Kaan. The time to be aggressive is when you have your weapon charge up, but even then, you want to wait for your opponents to jump on you instead of you jumping on them. You either let them come or you hook them to you, but you should almost never use space to engage and initiate since it is a very important ability to Ruh Kaan's survival. Once they made the jump on you, or they get hooked by you, it is then you unleash your full damage on them. Typically, if say I hooked the enemy, I would use my charged attack on him and proceed to quickly space right on top of him. This burst combo deals like a total of 34 damage without any Battlerites or debuffs, and is very strong. After using space and dealing that damage, if the enemy hasn't already jumped out with his escape ability, you can proceed to deal even more damage with your Mouse 1 ability, since he is cursed and receives even more damage from your Mouse 1. Otherwise, you can slowly back away with your Q ability up, and if you absorb some attacks, you're well and ready for another mini brawl using what I just mentioned. During downtimes of your weapon charge, you'll probably be poking with your right click, and this is especially effective against teams with no supports, since they'll struggle to heal through those damage that you've dealt to them. Rinse and repeat what I mentioned, use your other abilities like EXE ability and R defensively as necessary, and you should be all well and good with Ruh Kaan. A good thing to note though is that even though Sinister Strike is part of the combo that I mentioned, just try to keep in mind that you can and should sometimes use space for defensive purposes. Many times I see a Ruh Kaan just blindly chase after a certain ranged character, thinking that they can heal through the damage with their health draining abilities, only to be kited and receive even more damage themselves, instead of dealing meaningful damage to the enemy, and that is the wrong way to play Ruh Kaan. Now, let us talk about his strengths and weaknesses. I think that one of his main strengths is his good control over the battlefield and his ability to really punish bad positioning by enemies. With his hook ability, not only can he pull the orb to your team, he can also really punish an enemy if they overextend, dealing lots of unhealable damage before they get a chance to react. Furthermore, enemies who have burned their escapes just before getting hooked will be in for an even worse time if you decide to use your ultimate just at the moment, since it will be unlikely for them to be able to do anything against you unless they have help from a teammate. Another strength of his is his self-sufficiency. He has access to so many health draining abilities, and this makes it so that he can last for a good long while in 1v1 situations, as long as he plays right. It also makes it so he's a little less reliant on a support champion teammate. Finally, he is also pretty good in doing burst damage. His sustained damage is not very high with his Mouse 1, but I think his burst damage potential is really quite high actually. It is very often when I hook an enemy and proceed to deal almost 20% to 30% of his health in the next few seconds, all on my own, if he cannot respond appropriately in time. This will be even higher with a bit of help from a teammate. Just like with all things, Ruh Kaan has weaknesses too, and I think one of his weaknesses is his immobility and vulnerability during his ultimate. If you use your ultimate at the wrong time, it is so easy to get punished for it. It is very often that you get to use your ultimate with Ruh Kaan, since the shift space ability is hardly worth using. R is usually only used in real emergencies, and Shift E is also only used in desperate times for your teammate. And so because of this, just try to be careful of when you use the ultimate ability. The best example would be when against Pearl and she has an ultimate ready, and if you use your ultimate and she decides to use her ultimate on you, it's unlikely that you'll make it out of the AoE in time and get caught in it. Another weakness of Ruh Kaan is that he is a bit reliant on his weapon charge, and he is pretty weak when he has no weapon charge available. Not only will his mouse tool be slightly weaker, but more importantly, he also doesn't have that huge burst damage and self-heal potential. This makes it so that Ruh Kaan has to play really passively, and this is usually not ideal, since you want to have the option to really dish out that burst damage and take advantage of, when your opponent makes a mistake. Finally, I think that Ruh Kaan is also weaker when fighting against very long-range enemies. His hook doesn't have that long of a range compared to the few very long-range champions, and this will make it so that he has to try to close that gap somehow to do work, since poking with his mouse tool ability alone might not be enough to kill them. Using space to close the gap is usually not enough as well, since the range is really short, and using R to engage would mean one less escape option if things go bad. And I think this is a serious disadvantage, since there's less room for error for Ruh Kaan when he's trying to do something like that. And so that's about it for his playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Now, let us move on to Ruh Kaan's Battlerites options. Once again, you can pause the video to slowly read through every single Battlerites if you wish, before I go through my thoughts on his Battlerites, since it will take a long while for me to read it all out for you. And so pause now to read them all. Okay, now that you've read them all, let's continue. In the first tier, I think that there's a choice between Wicked Strike or Demonic Hunt. Most of the time, Shadow Fury isn't very good, since Shadow Bolt already has a low cooldown, and having 2 charges wouldn't help much, because you shouldn't really want to be standing still in a spot, casting 2 Shadow Bolts in a row really. For Demonic Hunt, I like to pick this when fighting against multiple range opponents. The extra mobility and escape option really helps, especially against multiple ranged enemies, and not to mention the extra damage it gives from being able to cast space twice. Wicked Strike would be the go-to choice for me most of the time, if there's maybe only one ranged opponent in the enemy team. The silence is always nice to break enemy combos, and also to punish the enemy even more for getting hit by a charged weapon hit. Moving on, I think that Leech Blade would be the go-to choice most of the time in the second tier. The 8 bonus healing from your charged mouse 1 hit really helps your survival and can sometimes be the difference maker. Lowering the cooldown of your E ability with Death Grip isn't that necessary I feel, because you want your mouse 1 ability to be charged up before you hook someone else to you to really burst them down, so having the E ability ready so often wouldn't help by much, since you'd still be waiting for your mouse 1 to charge up I think. The increased Shadow Bolt damage from Agony is decent, but it's a bit risky since you're missing out on a lot of healing from Leech Blade. If you find yourself matched very favourably against your opponents, then maybe taking Agony to finish games off faster might be a good thing, and so Agony is just a very situational pick I must say. On to the tier 3 Battlerites, I think that Nether Chains is very good if you pick Demonic Hunt in the first tier. Applying Curse on enemies you hit with space, which should happen quite frequently, will definitely help quite a bit, because of the extra damage and healing that you get when you land your mouse once on the enemy. Otherwise, Death Embrace would be the pick most of the time. The 1.2 seconds root is huge and will make it even more punishing for the enemy to have bad positioning, since the root effect will give you and your teammates even more time to really deal lots of damage on the enemy. Gorge really helps to reduce the cooldown of your Q ability, but I think that this isn't that great. Even though the Q ability is such a great defensive ability, it still doesn't help against AoE abilities, and you generally don't need it more often than what its cooldown is anyway. So I wouldn't recommend it over the other obviously better options in this tier. In the 4th tier, I think that each of the options are all quite viable. Obviously take Tane for more healing and survivability if you need it, but otherwise you have a choice between Reaper and Bane. Bane makes it so that enemies take extra damage from you and your allies if the enemy has the curse debuff, which can be a big deal, especially if you and your allies are coordinated. Reaper is a safer bet if there's less coordination in your team, since the more weapon charges you have, that means more damage and more healing, and if you took Wicked Strike in the first tier, that means more silences too. So in short, take Reaper most of the time, take Tane for more heals if you need it, and take Bane if you want more damage and your teammate is good at following up on a cursed enemy. Finally, in the 5th and final tier, both Hunger and Shadow Prowl has their uses I feel. As I mentioned, Ruh Kaan is quite vulnerable when using his ulti, since he is very immobile. Shadow Prowl helps reduce that weakness, and so I think it's a decent pick against enemies that are good at dealing with you when you're out. Otherwise, Hunger is really good, since it is quite a bit of a free AoE damage on all the enemies you pull toward you, especially if they don't have any escape options too. And so that's about it on Ruh Kaan's Battlerites. Now let us move on to some of my gameplay tips for playing Ruh Kaan, as well as some potential combos with him. My first tip for playing Ruh Kaan is to really look out for when you have or don't have your weapon charge. Usually when you don't have your weapon charge and you try to engage in a fight, you'll tend to lose more from the fight than the opponent, since your weapon charge is a big part of your damage and healing as well. So do be extra careful when you don't have your weapon charge ready. Absorbing an attack with your Q recharges your weapon, so that's a good thing to remember when you're waiting to recharge. Another tip I have for you when playing Ruh Kaan is to always carefully assess your positioning. Because his spacebar ability only goes a short distance, he can often be stuck in bad situations if he doesn't have enough energy to use R to completely get out of an area. So it is wise as a melee champion, and especially for Ruh Kaan, to try not to get stuck in those really bad spots. My next tip is with regards to his hook ability. Not only can it be used to hook and focus down a single enemy, it can also be used to reposition the central orb so that it is safer for you and your team to capture it. Against ranged enemies, it is often better to try to hook them to you instead of rushing ahead after them, for reasons I mentioned earlier in the video. It might be tempting to try to just keep rushing an enemy since Ruh Kaan is a melee champion after all, and he's supposed to be good at melee, right? But rushing after them is very wrong, unless maybe they're like one hit away from dying or something. Then maybe it is worth the risk of jumping in. On to the combos. As I mentioned earlier in the video, part of Ruh Kaan's main combo is to use a charged mouse 1 hit and then follow up with space. But there are other things that you can do to add to it as well. An obvious one is to hook the target to you before unleashing that main part of the combo. If you manage to squeeze in that one extra hit after the combo, this full hook, mouse 1 spacebar, mouse 1 combo deals 54 damage in total, which is around 20 to 25% of the max health of most champions. Ouch. And this is without any Battlerites effects added in too. Add on some damage from teammates, and that is one big punishment for that poor enemy. In terms of good teammates for Ruh Kaan, I think that most champions can go well with Ruh Kaan. Melee champions will like it that Ruh Kaan can hook enemies in for them. Ranged champions will like it that Ruh Kaan can control the battlefield effectively, like pulling melee champions off of ranged teammates for example, giving them an easier time doing damage. Support champions will make Ruh Kaan that much more tanky too, and just outlast the enemy. So overall, I think Ruh Kaan is a very good champion that trades well and can fit in most comps. He's great to have in the team since he is so versatile and has such good control as well. Strong burst damage potential, which is something Ruh Kaan has, is important in this game as well because of the whole unhealable damage thing in the game. So I would say Ruh Kaan is definitely a good champion to learn. It will just take some getting used to before success comes with him. And so yeah, that's about it for my Ruh Kaan guide. I hope you found it useful. I've tallied up the polls on my Paloma guide, and it seems like an Easmo guide will be up next. So subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for that. You can vote for which champion guide you want to see next after Easmo's guide by clicking on the I button at the top right now. Also, you can check out my other videos too if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching my video, and if you enjoyed it, be sure to hit the like button, comment and share this video with your friends as well. And until next time guys, have a great day and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.